How can I grow after what I saw, what I experienced in Vietnam? It's wrong. Again, things don't happen for that. Some people are able to make the best of things that happen. Post-traumatic growth. It happens when people begin to focus on the benefit. So what is the benefit of this trauma? It didn't happen for the best, but what have I learned from my cancer, for example? Well, to be closer to my family, to appreciate a breath, to appreciate the flowers, to enjoy my friends more. Didn't happen for the best, but I'm going to make the best of it, benefit finding. Or many people are able to find meaning in it through journaling, and we'll talk about journaling next class. Or people are able to share their experiences of the trauma. Remember the difference between Holocaust survivors and Vietnam vets. Holocaust survivors shared, talked about it, wrote about it. Vietnam vets ruminated about it. Going back to the Lyubomirsky study. And when you just ruminate without sharing, without taking it out, it becomes stronger, and then it's more likely to become PTSD. But he doesn't always do that. And it's important to understand the mechanism of post-traumatic growth. So here is the question that I had. This is a positive psychology course. Remember what positive psychology is that it focuses on what works. So the question that I asked myself as I was preparing for this course was this. Is there a positive equivalent to trauma? Something that is so powerful, yet positive, that will change the way our brain functions in an instance. Like a sledgehammer. Is there something like that? Or in other words, what I asked is, can a single positive experience create a positive channel that will lead to a permanent increase in well-being, calm, and positive memories? In other words, the opposite of PTSD. And again, ask and you shall receive. A question begins a quest. And as soon as I asked this question, it opened up channels that I didn't see before, that were literally right in front of my eyes. And this was the work that I've studied for many years of one of my intellectual heroes, Abraham Maslow, who talks about the peak experience. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is more hypothesis than well-grounded research. It's a hypothesis that I hope some of you will research either here as your senior thesis or in the future. We'll encourage people to research these ideas. Everything that I share in this class is based on very rigorous research. This is one area where it's a hypothesis. But bear with me and see what you think of it, of this hypothesis, explaining it. Because there is some research on it, not enough, for a stamp of approval yet. But think about it. Does it make sense? So let's see, what is a peak experience? Maslow's definition of a peak experience, it's a generalization for the best moments of the human being, for the happiest moments of life, for experiences of ecstasy, rapture, bliss, of the greatest joy. I found that such experiences came from experiences, such as creative ecstasies, moments of mature love, perfect sexual experiences, parental love, experiences of natural childbirth, and many others. Everyone, or most people, have experienced peak experiences. Again, whether it was with your girlfriend, boyfriend, whether it was reading a book, whether it was listening to your favorite piece of music. Just being one with the experience. It's what many theologians talk about as the religious experience, a spiritual experience, where you just walked through the yard, suddenly felt one with John Harvard. Well, maybe not. But experience just one with everything. This is the experience that they talk about in Zen, being connected to the present, feeling so good, so complete, like you don't need anything else. Everything is right here. I know I experienced my family at times. Last night, having dinner with my family and friends, we were sitting around and I just felt, this is it. What else do I need? Just being so complete, so in the moment. A peak experience. Now, these peak experiences usually don't last for very long. They come and they go. It's a peak. However, they can, and often do, have repercussions. Now, maybe you can see now where I'm going with this. So what I thought about when I thought about peak experiences was maybe, just maybe, this is positive equivalent to the trauma. Maybe it's a shock treatment of ecstasy that can have effects beyond just the experience itself, just like PTSD has effects beyond the experience itself. There are people today who are living and reliving 9/11. Still affecting them, still affecting their brain, created new channels, new pathways that didn't exist before 9/11/01. So is peak experience a shock treatment of ecstasy? If peak experience is the positive equivalent of a trauma, then the equivalent of a post-traumatic stress disorder is what I call post-peak experience order. I know, cheesy, but I think there is something behind it. Some research on it, some very little, but I think it actually works. So one of the research studies that was done on it was by one of Maslow's students. She studied women after childbirth. And what she found was that sometimes, not always, in fact, not most times, but often, these women experienced a peak experience, and it changed their lives. As a result of it, they became more confident, more generous and benevolent, and happier, just as a result of a single experience. A shock treatment of ecstasy, something which happened to them, which meant so much to them. Now, they did this research in the early 50s or early 50s. Today, it may also happen more often with men, because men today are more likely to be present when the child is born. I know that when David was born, I burst out crying. It was a very powerful experience when it happened. Certainly a peak experience for me. Here is what Maslow says about peak experiences, and again, not talking explicitly about post-peak experience, but alluding to it. Peak experiences often have consequences. They can do the same there as psychotherapy. If one keeps his goals right, and if one knows just what he is about, and if one is conscious of what he is going toward. We can certainly talk, on the one hand, of the breaking up of symptoms, like the breaking up of cliches, of anxieties, or the like. Or on the other hand, we can talk about the development of spontaneity, and of courage, and of Olympian or godlike humor and suchness, sensory awareness, body awareness, and the like. So what he's saying here is that these effects can have consequences beyond just the peak experience, if we do certain things, such as follow up on it. William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experiences, talks about such moments that change lives, and how they change lives. Peak experience can quite literally lead to a new brain order. And again, the jury's still out on the research, but there is more and more suggestions, and we'll talk about it next time as well, that show that there is something there. That it can be the positive equivalent of a trauma, if we know what we do to do with it. And here is the important issue. The question is, first, do we experience peak experiences, and experience more of them? And second, after we experience peak experience, how can we make it more likely that we enjoy PPEO? Because just like not everyone after a trauma experiences PTSD, in fact, the majority don't, just in the same way, most people don't experience PPEO after a peak experience. How do you increase the likelihood? First, increasing peak experience, and second, of increasing the likelihood of post-peak experience order. So to enhance peak experience, just very briefly, because essentially the course is about that. So I'm going to just throw out a few ideas we talked about, or some that we will talk about. First, permission to be human. Acceptance, accepting emotions. Why? Because if we don't accept painful emotions, if we don't give ourselves the permission to be human, we're blocking our emotional pathways. And positive emotions and painful emotions often flow through the same emotional pathways. And when we're limiting one, we're very often limiting the other. So if we open up the pathways, give ourselves the permission to be human, give ourselves the permission to cry when we're sad or ecstatic, that very often opens up, makes it more likely that we experience positive emotions as well. Paradoxical, but this is the paradox of the permission to be human. When we give ourselves the permission to experience painful emotions, we're more likely to experience the positive emotions. Mindfulness, being present. A lot of times when we're listening to music, for example, really listening to music, not just having it as a background while text messaging, doing homework, and talking to our friends. But when we really listen to music that we love, very often we have a peak experience, being present. According to Maslow's research, these are two of the most likely areas where we can experience the peak experience. And by the way, this I believe is innate. Even I see with Shirelle, my 1-year-old daughter, when there is music, when we dance, she laughs. This is not something we taught her. I think we're born with this inclination for music and dance. We need to take time. Having a meaningful goal, when we're on purpose, when we're doing things that we love to do, when we're doing is meaningful and significant to us, we're much more likely to experience peak experiences. Finally, one of the greatest barriers in our culture, time. It's very difficult to experience peak experiences when we're on the rush, when we're stressed and anxious. These are peak experience killers. Whether it's when making love, whether it's when listening to music, whether it's when spending time with friends, or all of the above together. How do we enhance the likelihood of PPEO? Once we've experienced peak experience. First thing, replaying and imagining. Remember, the mind doesn't know the difference between the imaginary and the real. It plays it over and over again. And when we play it over and over again, the neural pathway is reinforced. The sledgehammer begins the neural pathway, and then we reinforce it through replaying, through imagination. Writing about it. This is going to be your response paper next week. Writing about a peak experience. When we journal about it, describing it, not analyzing it. Remember the difference with Lyubomirsky. Positive emotions, positive experiences, it's not as helpful to analyze. So just to describe it, once again, reinforces the neural pathways. We relive it, we replay it. Once again, taking time. Taking time. And finally, taking action, which is how we can reinforce the initial experience of the peak experience. Reinforce the neural pathway. So I had an insight, an aha moment as a result of this peak experience. Now I'm going to do something about it and act, which leads me to the second point, which is behavior. I've been teaching and participating in workshops and seminars and classes on self-improvement, positive psychology, clinical psychology for almost 20 years. Before I was 20. And what I noticed in other people's workshops or in my workshops and seminars and classes is the following. Most people, if the workshop or the class is good, exit the classroom or the weekend or the semester. If they were here before, they usually experience a relative high after. But there are two groups of people. Both groups experience a relative high. The first group, which unfortunately are the majority, after that high, go back to their base level of happiness. Something we're familiar with. The second group, not the majority, but not a small minority, experience that high after. That high doesn't last forever. However, they go back, but when they go back, their base level of well-being is higher than it was before. And they continue to have their vicissitudes, but this time along a higher base level of happiness than before. Now, needless to say, I wanted to understand why people experience this, some people, and other people experience this, because I want people who take my class to enjoy lasting change, as opposed to temporary, nice, feels good, not enough. Justify the effort that they put into the workshop and doesn't justify the effort that I put into my work. So I wanted to understand the difference between the two. And here is the single most important difference that I identified between groups. Group 2, the distinguishing characteristic after the workshop or class or seminar, not at the end of the semester if it was a semester long, after each class or after many of the classes, introducing immediate behavioral change. They don't wait and say, okay, after the course is over, I'll reevaluate my life and see how I do. Introducing real behavioral change. Doing exercises that we talked about in class. Taking risks that they haven't before, but introducing change immediately. Not waiting. And those who introduce change immediately don't have a high or a peak experience constantly, but their base level of happiness goes up, as opposed to going down, returning to where it was before, no behavioral change. And now I start every workshop and seminar, when I have a few-day workshop or seminar, introducing this model of change. What we know from a lot of research in psychology is that there is a relationship between attitudes and behaviors. And we talked about it, we alluded to it already in the past. So we all have attitudes, whether it's attitudes about psychology, whether it's attitudes about another person, whether it's attitude about myself. And these attitudes affect our behavior. So for example, if I have a positive attitude towards psychology or positive psychology, I'm more likely to take 1504 than if my attitude towards psychology and positive psychology is negative. Or if I have a good attitude toward certain belief about a certain person, I'm much more likely to want to befriend this person if I like them than if I don't. So attitudes affect behavior. That's very clear, easy to understand. But what psychologists have found, the likes of Alice Eagley, Daryl Bem, and others, what they have found is that behavior also affects attitude. It works both ways. So if I behave in a certain way, it is likely to change my attitude in accordance with my behavior. And remember, we talked about it. Why? Because we have an attitude, and our behavior is the outside world. The mind doesn't like when there is incongruency between the inside and the outside. So if we behave a certain way, the attitude is going to be pulled down to reflect that behavior. If we behave in this way, the attitude, the mind doesn't like incongruency, it's going to create equality between the two, congruency, consistency between the two. And the way it will do that is either by changing our behavior, and here is the key, or more often by changing our attitude. Now, all of us here, whether you're 18 or whether you are 80, we all have habits. And again, we first make our habits, and then our habits make us. Habits are behavioral patterns, thinking patterns. Behaviors are more powerful, action is more powerful than words. If we have a certain behavior that we had before the class, what the class does is change your attitude about a certain thing. But if it doesn't match with your behavior, after the class, the mind looks for consistency, the attitude is going to be pulled down back to where it was before, unless your behavior changes to match your change of behavior. All a class can do, whether it's 1504 or Justice or Psych 1, all a class or a workshop, a seminar, all they can do is introduce attitudinal change. In this class, the attitudinal change is one, for example, self-esteem. What is self-esteem? The attitude that I have toward myself. High self-esteem, positive. Low self-esteem, negative. What is a benefit finder versus a fault finder? It's the attitude toward the world. Do I see it as positive, as a resource for well-being, or do I focus on the negative as a fault finder? Perfectionism. It's an attitude toward failure. But all this class can do, all I can do, all your TFs can do, is introduce or encourage attitudinal changes to convince you through research that learn to focus on the positive. However, if you don't follow up with behavior, and that means doing the gratitude study, the gratitude exercise, that means writing the letter, your response paper for this week, but doing it regularly. Unless behavior is going to follow, the attitude will go back and reflect your attitude and your behavior from before the class or before the intervention. There has to be behavioral change. Let me show you some studies showing the impact of behavioral change. This was done prisoners of war in American prisoners of war during the Korean War. And what Edgar Schein, who's just across the street here at MIT, showed was that the captors of the Americans got them to change their mind about communism, about the Chinese captors. How? Gradually. By simply asking them, write about the good things within communism. We know you don't like communism. You wouldn't be fighting us if you did. But write about the positives of it. Write it to your prison mates. Write letters home telling them how you're being treated. And making sure, of course, that they only focused on the good. So they didn't ask them to lie necessarily, though often they did. But they asked them to focus on the positive. Over time, their attitude actually changed. And they became actually more open and more positive toward their captors. Because their behavior, writing letters, talking to their friends about it, they had to give lectures on it, was one of, I feel positive about this, and their attitude over time actually changed, and they became more positive. Cognitive dissonance, those who've taken Psych 1 or others heard about it. Cognitive dissonance is when there is incongruence between two thoughts, when two beliefs are conflicting. We don't like it, we want there to be a match. Or when there is a conflict between behavior and a belief. And what cognitive dissonance says is that this dis-ease has to be resolved. And the way we resolve it is usually by getting our attitudes, our thoughts, our beliefs to match our behavior. Again, behavior is more powerful than words. Self-perception theory, we talked about a lot. I'm not going to elaborate on it anymore. We see ourselves and we derive certain conclusions about ourselves. Facial feedback hypothesis. If you put on a frown now, or a nice gentle smile, your body chemistry is actually going to change to reflect whatever your face is showing. So this is a quote by, where is it? By Thich Nhat Hanh, difficult to pronounce his name, a Buddhist monk. Sometimes your joy is the source of your smile, but sometimes your smile can be the source of your joy. So we actually influence our body. We actually influence our mood through our face. That's why actors very often can get into whatever character they're playing simply by acting. Because there is the facial feedback to the rest of your body. You actually release chemicals according with the face that you're making. William James. Whistling to keep up courage is no mere figure of speech. On the other hand, sit all day in a moping posture, sigh and reply to everything with a dismal voice, and your melancholy lingers. Smooth the brow, brighten the eyes, contract the dorsal rather than the ventral aspect of the frame, and speak in a major key, pass the genial compliment, and your heart must be frigid indeed if it does not gradually thaw. What essentially William James is talking about is something beyond the facial feedback hypothesis. It's something where there is not much research, just a little research on, which is the body feedback hypothesis. If you sit down all day like this versus upright and proud, it will affect your mood. It will affect how you feel about yourselves in a few ways. First of all, the message you communicate to yourself, self-perception theory, but also in terms of how other people perceive you. If you shake hands like this, limply, versus shake hands firmly, you're communicating a message to the person with whom you're shaking your hand. And that message comes back right at you, both in terms of how they perceive you, and that impacts you, but also in terms of how you perceive yourself. You know, one of the ex-students from 1504, she played, she was on the hockey team, just graduated last year. So I met her over the summer, and she comes over and she shakes my hand, and I was in tears. It hurt so much. And I thought she must have listened in class. So don't exaggerate. Just firm, nice. I mean, really, I think she broke some of the bones in my hand. But it matters. It communicates a message. You know, I'm not going to mess with her, ever. I'm scared of her right now. It communicates a message of strength and confidence. If we walk around proud, we're communicating a certain message. If we're walking around stooped, we're also communicating a message to the environment that then reflects on us, but also to ourselves. And that reflects on us too. And finally, I want to share a study with you. This is by Hammerly. This is a study done. You know what? Actually, I'm going to leave that to next time because I want to get to something important. So I'm going to start next time with this study because it's a long study, but it's a very important study. So I will talk about it next time, first thing in class. I want to get to something before we end, something that will change our relationship. Fake it till you make it. David Myers has done a lot of important work in this area of positive psychology. And what he showed was that very often, even if we act happy, even if we act with high self-esteem, even if I act joyful, as William James said, that affects our mood. The question now becomes, what about permission to be human? Well, first of all, there are times when we don't want to fake it till we make it. We want to cry, we want to be miserable, and we want to act that way. However, we need to find when is it the time to get out and to go to that party, even if it's the last thing in the world that I want to do. And the difference here is about active acceptance. I can still accept my emotions, I can still accept my pain and experience it, and still choose to act in accordance with how I deem most appropriate or most helpful. So I can accept the fact, I was just dumped, say, by my girlfriend. I can accept the fact that I feel terrible about it and awful, but then 3 days later, go out to Noakes and party. Go wild. So, faking it, again, because of the facial feedback hypothesis, because of the body feedback hypothesis, because of self-perception theory, the behavior will affect my attitude. And after a crazy night out in Noakes, I will actually feel better. And healthy, well, maybe not, but better. Here's a quick video of Marva Collins talking about some of her experiences.
I think what made me what I am is my parents and a consistency. I mean, I wanted to be as successful as my parents, my grandparents. In those days, it was quite rare to be black and to be successful. So I think the determination of my parents and grandparents, we would get chastised. As I say, I'm 14 years older than my one sister. But if we walked in church and didn't hold our heads up, my mom would say, "What was wrong with you today? Walking with your head all down." She would scream down the street, "Get your head up," on my way to school. People, I've often heard the comment to her, "I can always tell your child on the playground." We were brought up with a great sense of pride.
Get your head up. Walk up straight. When watch Marva Collins, that's how she walks. That's how she carries herself, and that communicates a message to her students, to other people, to herself. I'm going to jump to this point. So very often behavioral change is gradual. So what is the acute change? The acute change is about coping. It's about putting ourselves on the line. And when we cope, the important thing, it's to take the risk. It's to do something that we don't feel comfortable doing. In other words, it's about exiting our comfort zone and entering our stretch zone. Now, what I want to do now is share with you two stories from my past. Two stories that initially will seem unconnected, but as you will understand soon, are very much connected. One a difficult story, the other a difficult story. My first memory. Now, most people have a first memory, the first time when the first thing that you remember. My first memory is from September 1973. I was almost 3 years old, and it was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. And I remember being at home, and suddenly the phone rings. Now, the phone, my parents, Orthodox, I was raised Orthodox, the phone never rings on Shabbat, on a Saturday, let alone on Yom Kippur, but the phone rings. Both my parents, I remember them jump up and run to the phone. My dad picks it up, and I'm standing between my parents. He looks at my mom and says something, whispering. Couldn't hear what it was, but my mom's face changes. And there is terror, fear in her eyes. And I begin to tear. And my dad picks me up and says, I'm going for a few days, but I'll be back. Now I know what happened. So what happened was that my parents got a call from my uncle, who at that time was doing his reserves in the military. He's in intelligence. And war had just broke out. Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in Israel. The Israeli military most of the people are not on the borders, not protecting. It was a complete surprise. 5 Arab armies launch a war against Israel. My dad puts me down, goes to his room. From the top of I still see him taking out his army uniform, putting it on, taking his M16 submachine gun, putting it on, putting on his shoes, tying them, and my mom all the while with him, making him things. They're talking, once in a while smiling at me, but I sense a tension there. I don't know why. We then walked down to my dad's car, had a old turquoise Ford Cortina. He takes shoe polish and paints the lights of the car. Why? Again, later I know, because at night, when you drive with your lights on, you don't want the lights to be too bright in case of an air raid. So he paints the lights, and I watch him do all that. And then he picks me up and hugs me and says, once again, I'll be back in a few days. Gets into his car, and I begin to sob uncontrollably. One of our neighbors, whose name is Shalom, he's too old to go into the army, so he's standing there. We all look at my dad going off in the car, picks me up, and I'm crying. And he looks at me and says, Tal, do you want to be a soldier like Abba, like your dad, when you grow up? And I say, yes, I do. Well, soldiers don't cry. And I stopped crying. And I didn't cry for almost 20 years after that. And then I came to Harvard, and I started to study psychology. You know where I'm going, right? And I started to study psychology, and studying psychology, I realized that one of the things that I wanted to work on, one of the most important things that I wanted to work on, was getting in touch with my feminine side. You know, in Jung's language, yin and the yang, the anima and animus. I wanted to be more in touch with my feminine side because I knew that it wasn't healthy to repress emotions. I was repressing painful emotions. The exact same thing happens with positive emotions, same emotional channels. But I grew up in a culture that's very macho. Men don't cry. We're soldiers. We're tough. We can handle anything. And that's the culture that I grew up in. And again, this was my first memory. I heard the same thing over and over and over again. The same message. It's not cool. It's not manly to show emotions. It reminds me, after losing one of the most important squash tournaments for me, losing the national championships after I'd won it the year before. Surprise, wasn't supposed to lose it, was supposed to win. I go to my house with my girlfriend after, and we're just hanging out, and suddenly she begins to cry. And I say to her, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "I'm crying because you're not crying." Because she understood how important it was for me. And this is how I basically experienced my childhood, teenage, being tough, being macho. And then I came here and understood I need to let go. I need to be more in touch with the feminine side. So this is story number 1. Let me move on to story number 2. One of the students that I had here, some of you may know her, class of 04, was Lindsay Hyde. Lindsay Hyde studied with me. We had one-on-one tutorial as well. We worked a lot together. Lindsay Hyde is the founder of Strong Women, Strong Girls. Wonderful organization, part of PBHA. She founded it, now a national organization. I was also one of the founding board member of that organization. Wonderful stuff. swsg.org for those of you interested. And I was invited by Lindsay to give a talk for Strong Women, Strong Girls, for the mentors who were Harvard students, as well as students from women from other colleges around Boston. And I gave a talk, and here is Lindsay. Here she is with one of the students, third grade student, whom she mentors, and other Harvard students mentor, and do wonderful work. And I believe in this organization. I supported it from the get-go almost. And I gave a talk, and the talk was about teaching the importance of role modeling. It was about integrity. Talked to them about Marva Collins and about the important work that they were doing. And at the end of the talk, which went well, I think for myself, for the participants, I got a present, a gift, a token of appreciation. And the present was a shirt. It wasn't any shirt. It was a pink shirt, a color I don't normally wear. Certainly never wore it in Israel. Not only was it a pink shirt, it was, since it was a Strong Women, Strong Girls shirt, it was also a very small shirt, more suited for the third graders than for older ones. But still, they said, we want you to have it as a token of our appreciation. And then I made a mistake. And I said, jokingly, of course, was teaching 1504 at the time, I said jokingly, I will wear the shirt to class, and laughed. And here it is, the shirt that I got. And then there was another student of mine from 1504, Tori Martin, who ran the organization at that time, took over from Lindsay at Harvard. And Tori Martin said, I'm going to hold you to it. And I laughed and then almost cried. Because what do you mean hold me to it? I mean, I was joking. She said, look, you just talked to us about the importance of integrity, which I did. I mean, look here. Integrity, it's even on behind. I did. And I said, that's right, I did. So what, am I going to go back on my word? That's one of my core values, integrity. And then my whole childhood flashed before my eyes. And I thought about something that Churchill said, which was, find opportunity in difficulty. So I looked for the opportunity, and here was an opportunity handed to me in a pink shirt to be more in touch with my feminine side. So ladies and gentlemen, Spring Fashion 2008. Sorry, Barry. Oops. Now, I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but believe me when I say that this for me was going out of my comfort zone. In fact, maybe it was going out of my stretch zone a little bit, but into my panic zone. And I was telling the TFs before class that when I prepare for this class, and I have all my notes, here, and I write. Every time I went over it, or when I initially wrote it on my notes, there was an adrenaline rush in my stomach, going out of my comfort zone. Now, I'm also out of my comfort zone, which is why I had to have it at the end of the class, as opposed to the beginning of class. But the key is to attain optimum levels of discomfort. I may have overshot a little bit, but the key is optimum levels of discomfort. And why? There is no other way to change. I can think about it all day long and say, I want to be in touch with my feminine side, or I want to be more courageous. I want to get up. I can think about it all day long. Nothing will happen. Nothing will happen unless we bring about real, actual behavioral change. Real, actual behavioral action. And when we do that, then the sky's the limit. Thank you. I will see you on Thursday.